Welcome back. Sometimes we forget the sheer terror that the longer when we're removed from a moment. Do you remember back the 2008 financial collapse, the foreclosure crisis brought on by, among other things, risky loans by the big banks? Do you remember afterwards Congress passed new laws to make sure the banks are never that reckless again? Well, guess what? Congress is now rolling it back. Are we asking for trouble, or does it make sense, at least in some cases? And joining us for more are Kathy Collins, the Senior Vice President of Sable Palm Bank, former banking executive Eric Peters, and USF Sarasota Manatee economics instructor Michael Snipes. Thank you all for being here tonight. And Kathy, let me start with you, because I heard somebody else, in our story, Adam's story, saying that this is a good idea, but it's allowing some people to stretch into the mortgage market. Wasn't that part of the problem back in 2008, that people were stretching into the housing market that should not have been there in the first place?
Well, remember what's happened since then, and that's part of the past, but looking forward, and what the DoddFrank Act did, and what all financial institutions, all lenders are adhering to, has made a significant change in that happening, to prevent that from happening again. So as long as we continue to practice those same operations, and big banks put practices in place, community banks put practices in place.
Eric, is the problem only with the big banks? I saw in Adam's story it's a difference of having assets of $50 billion and $250 billion. There's a big difference there.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, there's a big difference. You have to look, I'm not for the rollback of this whatsoever, because you have to look at this act was put in place because of the financial collapse of what happened. And you have to look at the small banks, what happened to them, and the collapse of the fall of the small banks, of where we were back then. Back in 10 years ago, we had 308 banks, community banks in the state of Florida. Today we have 137. We had 550 failed banks, 70 in Florida between 2000 and 2012 because of what happened.
And we're going to pick up on that more, but Michael, when you hear those numbers, what was the impact on our economy, short-term and long-term?
Well, it had an effect pretty much similar to what we saw around the rest of the country. I mean, we saw a lot of smaller banks. If they didn't fold, they got bought out by bigger banks. The banking industry, financial sector in general, became more concentrated. And that's something that you saw really across this country. That's really something you saw here in Florida too. And a lot of the measures that were put into place were really designed to introduce a level of stability into the economy and the banking sector.
Okay, we are just getting warmed up, and our conversation on the rollback of the Dodd-Frank Banking Act continues. Welcome back. We are talking about the rollback of the Dodd-Frank Banking Act, and joining us for more are the Senior Vice President of Sable Palm Bank, Kathy Collins, former bank executive Eric Peters, and USF Sarasota Manatee economics instructor Michael Snipes. Eric, let me start with you, because Adam reported in this piece that this was led by Republican members of Congress, but there are stories that there were 17 Senate Democrats who voted for this, and a lot of Democrats in the House, including Jim Himes from Connecticut, who's known as a liberal Democrat. So why is it so controversial to roll back at least some of the Dodd-Frank when it applies to smaller community banks?
You have to look at why this was even put in place. It's the small community banks, it's their lobbyists that wanted it done, so they were lobbying the members of Congress to have this done. Was there a need for this? No, there was absolutely no need to have this done whatsoever. Banks are just making record profits today. So why this all came about, it wasn't John Q. Public going to their congressman and said, hey, let's roll back this act. There was nobody down my street saying, yes, let's do it. It was the lobbyists for the small community banks that started this.
Kathy, let me give you a chance to respond.
Right, and remember, Dodd-Frank was a very large piece of information and directives that were imposed upon us without question. I think the big difference today is what Dodd-Frank has done, has put, again, practices in place. As a community bank, we listen to our customers, and our customers are the ones that feel the effects. This is simply relating to how business processes a product. We simply deliver funds and collect funds within the bank. By doing that, our customers, because we're a community bank, talk to us directly. And with that information, it does allow us to get armed, if you will, to go back into the administration and talk about the things that impact community.
Michael, we all do remember that after 2008, it became a lot harder for a lot of people to get mortgages. But, you know, Congress and the government did not want another situation where there was a housing bubble and you know, discovery that there were just a lot of really questionable loans put out there. So is there a happy medium here?
I suppose there could be a happy medium, and I think that some of the proposals that have been rolled back or being on the table to be rolled back could potentially help smaller banks conduct business, you know, a little bit more efficiently. But a lot of the problem and a lot of the reason why Dodd-Frank was put into place in the first place wasn't necessarily that it was the small banks that were the problem. It was the bigger banks, the ones that were, you know, as we've all heard the phrase, too big to fail. Those were the ones that were really the bigger problem. And it was really a lot of the actions that they were doing and how that kind of filtered through to the smaller banks. It was a lot of the actions that they were doing that really kind of was the genesis for all this.
All right, we are still getting warmed up in our conversation about the rollback of the Dodd-Frank banking regulations. Will continue after a quick break, so stay with us. Welcome back. If you're just tuning in, we are talking about the rollback of the Dodd-Frank Banking Act. And joining us for more, our Senior Vice President of Sable Palm Bank, Kathy Cullums, former bank executive Eric Peters, and USF Sarasota Manatee Economics instructor Michael Snikes. Eric, I'm going to start with you again to pick up on what Michael was talking about. The biggest problem in 2008 in terms of the economic collapse was the big banks, not necessarily the community banks. So if we are drawing that distinction in the Dodd-Frank regulations, is that not a good thing?
It was a combination. It was the big banks. I worked for the big banks, so I saw the meltdown firsthand of what happened. But it affected also, you have to remember, it affected the community banks. It affected over 10 community banks here in Sarasota, Manatee. But like I said, I worked for one of the large ones, and it was all credit score driven. Nobody required people to put in money. And like I said, the west coast of Florida was probably the epicenter of the problem that we saw nationwide.
Right, but when we're talking about that, even though it was the epicenter, was it the big banks or the local community banks which were the, I don't want to say villain here, but more responsible?
I think it was just across the board. Because I was in competition not only with SunTrust and Regions and everybody else. I was in competition with all the smaller community banks also. So I think it was across the board. You could not say it was just one single entity.
Yeah, and a lot of the times, regardless of where the mortgages really originated, a lot of the times they're going to get, they got bundled up into these collateralized debt obligations, right? Basically some sort of derivative, and they got collapsed into these mechanisms. And these derivatives then got sold to whoever the highest bidder was, and a lot of the time the highest bidder was those big banks. So even if a small regional bank was acting responsibly, any kind of mortgage or debt that was created by that bank was then put into the free market and anybody could act on it.
Kathy, as we reported a little while ago, there are many fewer community banks in Florida now than there were in 2008, and that's not a good thing. It might be good for, you know, Sable Palm in terms of surviving and thriving in this environment, but there are fewer of you out there. So doesn't that kind of underscore the need to make sure that there are regulations like this in place to make sure that we don't go too far out on the plank there?
Absolutely. And to your point, there was a fear factor of starting a new bank, and you can imagine why. You know, you saw what happened, and do you want to be a part of that? Will you get the capital from people to be a part of that? But I think what's different, there are some, again, new requirements in place. Your board must have bank background experience coming onto your boards now. Most of your new startups, and part of a healthy economy and a good balanced competitive playing field is to have another local community bank come to our area. Unfortunately, that is going to come to fruition. And that's what's good about community banking, bringing that competition in. We have our niche. We do a great job for our community. We do more than just serve our local community. We serve not-for-profits. We serve so many other areas that build on the strength of what community is about.
So, Eric, other than saying that the banking industry, whether it's big banks or community banks, is doing pretty well right now, and that you're very concerned about the behavior of the big banks, are you very concerned about basically rolling back these regulations on smaller community banks?
Of course, because the small and medium-sized banks, they're not going to be required to undergo the stress test. That's part of the rollback. And that's part of the problem also, because you look how many banks have failed. They're the ones, the bigger banks are well capitalized today. Nothing's really changed for them on the capitalization. But now in the small and medium size, you do not have those stress tests out there. And who failed before? Let's look at who failed. The big banks did not fail, even though there was the TARP money, all that, but it was the smaller community banks. They're the ones that failed.
Michael, what does this mean to the average consumer who's watching this right now? Because there are a lot of people who are still living with the after effect of the 2008 collapse. There are a lot of people out there who are making a lot less money than they used to. Their credit scores may not have recovered, but because of circumstance, they do aspire to get back into the housing market.
Yeah, and I think short term it remains to be seen exactly what the effect of all of these rollbacks are going to be. But I think at a more macro level, the 20,000-foot view, really a lot of these rollbacks are going to be implemented at a federal level. So it's going to, some of the rollbacks that have been proposed are going to give Congress more control over who's appointed to regulatory boards. It's going to give more control over the budget that funds some of these agencies. It's going to give them more control over their funding. And if they so choose, they can choose to completely defund some of these programs and some of these agencies designed to protect consumers.
We're already seeing that. The Consumer Bureau that we were talking about is their funding is being cut drastically. And I would imagine, Kathy, that a lot of people who are put on these boards and who are overseeing are going to be reflective of the administration in power, which is right now for real deregulation.
And again, when you think back about all of those circumstances and again, talking about big banks, too big to fail, DoddFrank came in and put layer upon layer upon layer of requirements into the system, into the financial system. When you take, it was time for that to be reviewed. It's just like putting into practice, building a house and forgetting that you left parts of the structure left off because it was done so quickly.
But let me challenge you on that, because didn't we learn through that experience that we cannot rely on big businesses, let alone big banks, to actually do maybe the smart thing when there is a profit motive out there that is controlling things? Isn't that how we got into trouble in the first place?
Well, I can't speak to the big banks. Eric could probably speak to that better, because as a community bank, we're dealing with local people's money who have been invested as shareholders, and that's where we owe our responsibility to. So to speak to the big banks and what goes on at that level, it may not happen.
And Eric, let me give you the flip side of that, because if you're talking about rolling back these regulations, I would imagine the argument would be is less red tape will mean fewer costs to consumers and less expensive loans, and isn't that the best way to grow an economy?
Well, again, I say why repeal? Because today the banks are flush with cash. If you look at the last quarter of 2018, banks made $56 billion in profits. So why? Everybody's making money on this right now. Why do we need to roll any of this back?
Michael, are we seeing any evidence right now that the big banks in particular, or even in the community banking field, are already going back to ways of making questionable decisions and loans?
It's still a little early to kind of really see changes in behavior, changes in judgment, but there's not necessarily any reason to believe that they wouldn't go back to some of the practices that they had in the past. And one of the things that's being proposed, rolled back, is what's called the Volcker Rule, which was put into place to say that banks couldn't make speculative investments with the money that their members invested in their bank. And if that gets repealed, then that really just opens the doors for these banks to really engage in a lot of the same behavior that they were doing in 2002, 2007, and 2008. If that gets repealed, that opens Pandora's box.
We only have a couple of seconds left, Kathy, but what about to that point? Is there a difference between streamlining regulations and allowing banks to go back to some of these questionable practices?
Well, I think that's an apples and oranges comparison, and a community bank like Sable Palm Bank cannot be compared to a bank like Bank of America.
Okay, we're going to pick up on that in a moment. We have to take a quick break, and we'll be back for final thoughts in a moment. And our guests join us right now for final thoughts. So, Kathy, what do you want people to walk away from this conversation about the rollback of Dodd-Frank when it comes to community banks? Good thing, bad thing?
Well, remember, Dodd-Frank is still in place. It did not go away, and I know that there's been some comments made and maybe some misunderstandings that Dodd-Frank went away. It did not go away. There were little pieces that were refined within the act that will definitely help community banks. We're happy with those changes. We'll continue to do business the way we have been doing business. We plan to make a profit, yes. And what this does is it allows us to minimize a lot of the back office support work and the staffing that's required, would have been required, had this been fully implemented.
Eric, what concerns you the most?
My concern is really living through the downturn that happened back in 2008 and going forward. We don't need to see that happen again, nor does the public really need to see that. You had the unemployment, you had a terrible, terrible recession, and especially here on the west coast of Florida and other places. There was no need for this to go back. It was put in place for a certain reason there, and the economy is doing very well today, so I don't know why it transpired other than a profit motive.
Well, but to Kathy's point that most of what is helpful to community banks is mostly streamlining of certain things.
The streamline, because you don't have to hire people to handle the regulations. So there's a profit motive right there. So you hire less people to carry out the regulations.
And Michael, from the economics perspective here, do you have major concerns, or are you really seeing that there are both sides here?
Well, I mean, I think that there are arguments you can make on both sides. I mean, I think that it could help, certainly could help with streamlining of small banks and small businesses, could help them streamline, could help them run a little bit more efficiently. And Dodd-Frank is still in place, but a lot of these regulations are really designed to kind of weaken Dodd-Frank and not necessarily repeal and replace it with anything.
Kathy, let me finally just ask you to Eric's point that you know, nothing was broken here. You were still making profits, so why did you need to fix anything?
Well, again, the full effect of the change had not been implemented yet. So some of those directives were up and coming. So that's why I say those parts that have been removed will allow us to focus on the customer, deliver a good product at a good price, a competitive price, be able to make loans in the marketplace at fair rates, and again, serve the community that we live in.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. I want to thank you all. We want to thank our guests, Kathy Cullums, Eric Peters, and Michael Snipes.